got more of Keith on the cans, he says.
I can't hear myself.
Well, Keith, I thought of having the solo on the fourth one instead of the... Because that's the way, it's the way it sort of is, you know.
By 1968, the Stones, fresh from a lengthy battle with the judicial system, now completely embodied an anti-establishment image. Their jail time had been dropped and they hadn't been silenced. In other words, they'd won the battle against the establishment. They now embraced the diabolical side of swinging London and set out to cause out-and-out mayhem. Stones had been pulled into a fight and suffered the first blow. They now came out all guns blazing. They used the word satanic in their album title. They sang lyrics such as, "The time is right for fighting in the street." They opened their next album, Beggars Banquet, with a track titled Sympathy for the Devil. They agreed to be filmed during sessions to appear in a movie pushing revolution and Marxist ideologies. Mick Jagger had begun reading into Satanism. He would take an acting role in the film performance, of which the director had connections to the occultist Aleister Crowley. Devil was frequently mentioned in Keith Richards' idol Robert Johnson's compositions, and his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg obsessively studied the occult. But ultimately they used satanic imagery to rebel against the establishment. The poor reception they received from Satanic Majesties, the Stones abandoned their psychedelic image. Keith especially hated the album. He called it a load of shit. He felt the self-production and the chaotic recording process didn't serve the band well. He now began studying the blues again. It was now Keith would rediscover open tunings. He later stated, "It transformed my life." Of course, he wasn't totally new to open tunings. Brian had used these in the early days. The big difference was, Keith now began playing them without the use of a slide. It was revolutionary for him. He now felt it could translate over so many of the sounds he had in his head. His experimentation, many believe, was a result of Andrew Oldham's departure. In other words, he was free from the Phil Spector-esque influence. It would be a strange year for Keith. Musically, he'd rediscover his love for the guitar and hit a creative peak. Personally, he'll be racked with jealousy and fear his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg would leave him. He feared she was having an affair with Marlon Brando. He feared she was having an affair with Mick Jagger. One of these fears would come true. The album would contain a mix of standard open D and open E compositions. Sensing the end was near for Brian, at least as a member of the Rolling Stones, Keith also began learning slide guitar. He figured he'd need to fill in for Brian's parts. Keith had always used Philips tape recorders as a tool to store any guitar riffs, but for the first time it would be used as a recording technique in the studio. He and Mick would drive the band through the recording of Beggars Banquet. Brian by this point personified the drugged out rock star. His involvement in the album was minimal. Keith had taken his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg from him, and in doing so left his own girlfriend Linda Keith. The two, both in a sad state, had begun a relationship with each other. Linda moved into Brian's second-storey flat in Chelsea, which he'd been renting since 1965. By the end of the year, Brian would purchase a 16th century farmhouse in the countryside. It became a refuge, a place to escape the pressures of the band. Ironically, it was the same place that would see his demise. This is the story of the Rolling Stones' Beggars Banquet.
Should start off very cool. Should be very cool.
With the chaotic year of 1967 over with, as 1968 begins, things were looking up. The year began with university professors in California deciding the Stones have such an important contribution, it's essential for music students to study them. Meanwhile, Mick, Keith and Brian are all out of the country. Bill Wyman isn't in the mood for travelling as he's going through divorce proceedings and lost custody of his son. Charlie Watts, the most stable of the group, is sat at home with his jazz collection and American Civil War memorabilia. In fact, Charlie Watts never cared for fame. It was the lifestyle that afforded him that was, in his eyes, a fair trade. Polar opposite to Keith and Mick, he preferred to stay away from drugs and politics. He lived in a 16th century cottage in East Sussex. The rooms were filled with antiques and books. When Charlie sold the house, the estate agents commented it had been well looked after. Bill Wyman was not so content. The impending divorce and losing custody of his son was all too much. he suffered a panic attack in his home in early February. When he contacted a doctor, he was prescribed sleeping pills. After he took one, he freaked out even more. He paced the rooms of his mansion before the effects wore off. He would never take another sleeping pill again after that. Some weeks later, he had a medical checkup, but everything was fine. On their return to England, Mick and Brian appeared now heavily bearded. Keith, left paranoid by the police, has a 6-foot wall built around Redlands to provide security and privacy. He also has the moat extended so it goes entirely around the house. His girlfriend Anita Pallenberg now began to attend recording sessions and state her opinions on the Stones' songs. She became something of a Yoko Ono character in the Stones' world. She later stated, "I feel as though I'm rather like the 6th Rolling Stone. Mick, Keith and Brian need me to guide them, critique them, and to give them ideas." Marianne Faithfull, Mick's girlfriend at the time, recalled being so impressed Mick had come out of prison unfazed and unshaken. She was at this point still technically married to her ex-husband John Dunbar. Not only that, the two had a child together. By this point, they'd long been separated. Dunbar, though, was still holding on to hope he and Marianne would reconcile. This time, Mick, Marianne and her child Nicholas were living in a townhouse in Chester Square, London. One day the year previous, Dunbar had showed up to the house, had a blazing row with Mick and called him a cheap version of a Beatle. Mick was surprised and speechless. The anger had stemmed from the fact that Mick, in his eyes, had taken his wife and son. Indeed, Mick was very fond of Nicholas, and in turn, Nicholas loved him. The two problems the Rolling Stones were now facing was first their money situation. It didn't sit easy that their manager Alan Klein had deposited their $1.2 million advance from Decca into his bank account. That was in 1965, and he was still handing them out money as and when. The second problem was their reputation in the ever-evolving musical climate. Going forward, the group knew they had to recapture the interest of their fans. Without much deliberation, they dropped the psychedelia. Keith returned to his blues roots. Mick stopped the flower power persona. For their next album, they knew they would need a more disciplined approach. With Andrew Oldham's departure, Mick now brings in Jimmy Miller as their new producer. Miller had previously worked with groups Steve Winwood was part of. Mick contacted him in early '68 as he liked the work he'd done with Traffic. Mick told Miller that he'd produced Satanic Majesties, but he had no intention of being on both sides of the control room window again. Miller would produce the Stones' next 4 albums. His first change as a producer was to demote Glyn Johns and bring in his own studio engineer. The next single, Jumping Jack Flash, encapsulated all the emotions from 1967. Mick described it as going through a difficult time and emerging stronger on the other side. It also showcased the return to their blues roots. Brian, who was now lost in drug use, had no interest in the revival of the group. The new direction they were going in, he'd lost any interest in rock and roll at all. In truth, he was now rarely sober. In January, he'd visited Jimi Hendrix, who was recording all along the Watchtower in Olympic Studios. He played piano for the track, but passed out halfway through. He was at this point part of the Stones only by name. The new producer Jimmy Miller had been recruited without even consulting Brian. Still, a meeting with him and Brian was scheduled. At said meeting, Miller reassured Brian there was no pressure and he could contribute when he felt like it. Side note, before I begin talking about the sessions, I must point out it's unclear to exactly when the sessions took place, with different books giving different accounts. I've assembled what I think is the most likely chronology of the recordings. Sessions begin on March 1st with the recording of Jumping Jack Flash. The song had actually been written by Bill Wyman along with Charlie and Brian during a jam session in February. Mick and Keith, as usual, showed up late but immediately saw big potential in the sound. Mick stated, "Keep playing that and don't forget it, it sounds great." It often happened that Bill, Charlie and Brian contributed crucial parts. One time after finishing a song, Bill had turned around and said to Mick, "That part I did in the middle worked great." To which Mick replied, "That was my idea." Bill had often tried to argue royalties should be doled out equally depending on who contributed most to the song, but he never got the support from Brian and Charlie that was needed, so he would often be battling Mick, Keith and Andrew Oldham. Over the years, he simply gave up. The other three Stones never did get the songwriting credits they were due. For the song, Mick had some partially written lyrics. They were inspired by Keith's gardener Jack Dyer. Mick and Keith had been up all night at Redlands. Mick had dozed off and was awoken by the heavy stomps of Keith's gardener walking around in his rubber boots. Startled, Mick asked, "What's that?" Keith replied, "That's Jumping Jack," then started working on the lines Jumping Jack, strumming his acoustic guitar. He repeated Jumping Jack, then Mick added the line Flash, and that was that. In '66, Keith had bought the latest Philips cassette recorder with the intention of laying down demos. He found when he overloaded the tape, it sounded like an electric guitar. Keith recorded the riff in open D and brought his work to the studio. The rest of the band thought he was mad, but they indulged him anyway. This new sound gave birth to the Stones' rock tone Mick and Keith had been searching for. Put them back at the top of the charts, brought them back from the dead, and began the third phase of their career. The opening of the song, you hear Keith's overloaded Gibson Hummingbird. To anyone who doesn't understand the concept, this basically means Keith recorded the acoustic guitar part at home with his Gibson Hummingbird on his Philips cassette recorder. The Hummingbird was in open D tuning with a capo on the 2nd fret. He turned the gain levels up on the cassette recorder very high as to overload the signal, and when he played it back, it had acted both as a pickup and an amp. Keith brought the recorded parts into the studio. The band tried to replicate the sound, but eventually they gave up, and Jimmy Miller placed a microphone near the cassette and recorded straight from that. He turned the volume up to max on the cassette player, played it back, and recorded what he had. As the track played, Keith added some bass on his Fender Precision, and Brian added some guitar using Keith's Gibson ES330. To give context to how new cassette tape recording was at this time, the Philips EL3300 was the first cassette player ever made.
Meet the easiest to operate tape recorder in the world. Philips cassette loading battery recorder. It's easy because tape comes in compact cassettes that you clip in for instant use.
Keith looks back on the track to this day as, in his words, the best thing we ever did with Jimmy Miller. He also stated, if he could only ever play one Stones song for the rest of his life, it would be Jumping Jack Flash. Mick remembered it differently. He later stated he didn't like the recording session. He felt it was a bit haphazard and went on to say the song wasn't quite what he wanted. Sessions continued with Jumping Jack Flash on the 16th of March. When Brian returned home to his flat, he found the door had been kicked in and Linda had overdosed. The police had been tipped off, kicked in the door and rushed her to hospital. Following this, Brian, who had never lost his interest in weird and wonderful music and had been delving into the African roots of music, decided to travel to Morocco to record the tribal drum musicians. He had a plan to record them and overdub R&B music. He and Glyn Johns flew over, where they stayed in great luxury at Paul Getty Jr.'s palace. Getty's father was an oil tycoon and thus incredibly wealthy. The palace was tiled throughout and lit by candlelight at night. It was the first time Glyn Johns had been out of Europe, the first time he'd ever tasted fresh orange juice. He loved the experience. From the arrival though, Brian was stoned and remained that way throughout the entire trip. Soon, Paul Getty Jr. felt Brian was overstaying his welcome. When the musicians were recorded and Glyn Johns was packing up and ready to go, Getty told Johns in no uncertain terms if he was leaving, he had to take Brian with him. Glyn's later stated, "I felt sorry for Brian at the end. He didn't have any real friends left." Side note, Paul Getty Jr.'s wife would die of a heroin overdose not long after, and he would thereon become a recluse. Of the tapes that were recorded, nothing ever came of them. Rumours circulated they weren't recorded properly, but to this day, Glyn Johns insists they were fine. Mick, meanwhile, was rarely home when not recording. There were always people around him. People just wanted to be around him all the time. The trial acquittal from the year previous had bonded him and Keith, but it would prove to be short-lived. The next song they began with on March 13th was No Expectations. It was in complete contrast to Jumping Jack Flash. Slow acoustic ballad, that lyrically borrows heavy from Robert Johnson's Love in Vain. It's a song about the acceptance of a shattered relationship. It's fitting that Brian Jones made his last real contribution to this song, adding a haunting slide guitar. Indeed, the song's story echoes Brian's feelings of the group. The narrator affectionately remembers the past with no illusions it will return, though maybe that's a romantic view and the story Jones never considered. Most likely, he was just enthusiastic they were basically rehashing a Robert Johnson song. Either way, the track was a perfect example of the Stones returning to their blues roots. During the session, Keith had played it in standard tuning on his acoustic Gibson Hummingbird. Brian played slide guitar on his electric Fender Telecaster, fitting perfectly with Jagger's lyrics. Our love, like our music, is here and then it's gone. Brian would have no real involvement again with the Rolling Stones. He would turn up to sessions, but he'd play what they told him to. He wasn't really involved. He was just going through the motions. In truth, the others didn't really want him there. At the same time, a single was released Bill had produced, a psychedelic rock track titled Shades of Orange by the End. It was easily lost in the competitive market of 1968 psychedelic rock. The next song they began was Stray Cat Blues. The song was heavily inspired by the Velvet Underground's Heroin. Mick later admitted it was basically an imitation of the band. The story, a pretty controversial subject, with the narrator lusting after a 15-year-old groupie. The narrator, a renowned figure, is no fool, but at the same time, the young girl is hardly naive either. Gone are the days Chuck Berry sang Sweet Little 16 or Sam Cooke Only 16. This Stones song brings an air of decadence to the subject. Mick reasons in the song it's no hanging matter or capital crime. The age of consent in 1968 being 16, though the subject of the narrator's desire a year younger. During the 1970s Get Your Ya-Ya's Out concert, Mick changed the lyrics from I can see that you're 15 years old to I can see that you're 13 years old. Mick later stated it was a deliberate attempt to stir up controversy. During the sessions, Keith plays his Les Paul in open D. Brian Jones doesn't accompany him on guitar. Keith plays both parts. He adds a second lead guitar for the chorus, which will stay for the remainder of the song. Brian enters at 2:48 on the Mellotron, but there's not much added by him. Later, when the song had been completed and mixed, Mick played it back for Anita Pallenberg and asked what she thought. She stated, "Crap, the vocals are mixed too high and the bass isn't loud enough." On the 23rd of March, recording began for their next song, Jigsaw Puzzle. The first song with a clear Bob Dylan influence, with the ambiguous lyrics and chaotic instrumentation. The story follows the narrator assembling a jigsaw puzzle amongst chaotic characters disturbing him. It's a metaphor for somebody attempting to create order in a world of disorder. In the song, the narrator talks about a band, possibly his own. He describes the guitarists as emotionally shattered, the bassist having relationship troubles, the drummer struggling to fit in with the group, and the singer thrown into an impossible situation without help. These early recordings can be found on the Rolling Stones' Beggars Banquet sessions released in 2014. Keith later stated, "The song went on a bit too long." Keith takes 3 guitar parts in this song, strumming his acoustic Gibson in standard while he accompanies himself on electric slide guitar with another lead guitar added. Both accompanying electric parts were done using his Les Paul. The electric slide guitar part was tuned to open E. Keith was still working out slide, and you can clearly hear that during the record. Brian can be heard playing Mellotron, though Keith later stated we were just giving him something to do at the time. Next they begin on Parachute Woman. The story is just one sexual innuendo, no deep meaning behind it. It was another one Keith laid down his Hummingbird, then played it back on an overloaded cassette tape. He accompanied himself on his Les Paul in standard tuning for the lead. The guitar sound of Parachute Woman Keith had envisioned in his head. He was surprised how easily it translated to the record. For the song, Brian contributed on acoustic guitar. Mick provided lead vocals and played harmonica at the end of the song. The song was a testament to both the group returning to their bluesy roots and their willingness to push boundaries with provocative lyrics. Musically and lyrically, it embodied their rebellious attitude. Next, they began recording what will be the closing track of the album, Keith Richards' composition, Salt of the Earth. The lyrics were taken when he once declared, "Let's drink to the hard-working people. Let's drink to the salt of the earth." Keith admitted in his book Life, he only wrote the chorus, Mick penned all the verses. The words are also a biblical phrase, "You are the salt of the earth," meaning someone is invaluable and essential. The story was a simple tribute to everyday people who kept society running, a celebration of everyday heroes. In the song, two things happened for the first time in Stones history. Keith was recorded singing solo, and a female choir was on a Stones record. The song closed Beggars Banquet with a gospel-like sing-along. It was at this time Keith came up with the title Beggars Banquet. It was taken from his gardener, who would often state, "Beggars can't be choosers." So focused on his sound, Keith now personified the flute player sitting in the window. He carried a guitar with him everywhere he went. Marianne Faithfull stated he was always working on something. This time, Mick begins thinking seriously about acting. Though he wasn't their manager anymore, Andrew Oldham was still a potential business partner. He at this time was stating he would soon own the rights to Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. Mick would be his choice to play Alex. Nothing came of it, but nonetheless, Mick began taking acting lessons. As April begins, the group take a break from recording and go on holiday. Mick and Marianne travel to Dublin, where Marianne becomes pregnant. Keith and Anita fly to Rome, where Anita is shooting for the film Candy. Brian and Linda fly to Spain for 4 days, and Bill visits the West Country for 3 days. This time, Donald Camell, a friend of Mick's, began talking to him about a film idea he had. It is to revolve around a reclusive rock star and a gangster on the lam. On their return, Mick decides the group should open their own rehearsal studio. They could practice there and also let other artists use it. Thinking about the money costs, Bill Wyman vehemently opposes the idea. But it's no use. He's outvoted by the other members. On April 28th, music videos are taped for their new single Jumping Jack Flash and its B-side Child of the Moon. Michael Lindsay Hogg, the producer of Ready Steady Go, directs the videos. He was also a close friend of Mick's. The first video to be shot, Child of the Moon, which will be the B-side to their next single, was shot on the 150-acre grounds of Swarksley's estate in Uxbridge. It was chosen for both the picturesque and eerie atmosphere. Afterwards, they returned to Olympic Studios to shoot Jumping Jack Flash. 4 camera crews were used, and Michael charges £675 for his services. Shooting costs come to $2,453. Needless to say, when their bill came through, Bill Wyman almost had a heart attack. It made the rest of the group finally take action with their finances. It had gone on long enough with Klein. Mick had been looking closely into the Stones' financial affairs. He had a fundamental understanding of finance from his days at the London School of Economics, but managing the intricate financial affairs of a hugely successful rock band was an entirely different ballgame. The complexities involved in royalties, taxes, and business deals required specialised knowledge. The group now had no other option but to hire solicitors to look into the matter. Immediately, the solicitors wrote to Alan Klein requesting payment information from the Stones' 1966 World Tour, 1967 European Tour, and royalties paid to Mick and Keith. As May begins, the money situation for some Stones becomes desperate. Bill Wyman is down to £50 in his bank account. He has a telegram sent to Klein stating he's penniless and needs £5,000 put into his bank account immediately. Amazingly, 4 days later, he receives the money. Then, another 2 weeks later, he receives £2,000 in unpaid expenses from the previous years. Brian receives the same. Then, more checks of £5,000 from Klein. At the same time, Mick and Keith received £21,000 each. It seems solicitors looking into the affairs have shaken Klein. On May 12th, the Stones played the Enemy Poll Winners concert in Wembley. For this performance, Jumping Jack Flash is played for the very first time. Reaction is outstanding. The group are very pleased, and it renews their enthusiasm for live performance. He plays his Les Paul, and Brian accompanies him on his Gibson ES330. Other than the Rock and Roll Circus, this will be the last time Brian performs live with the band. 3 days later, Brian is interviewed for BBC Radio.
And Keith asked Brian whether it was a very important record for the Rolling Stones.
Well, I think it is because of the timing. I'm hoping, in my heart of hearts, it's going to be a very big record. I think it's a great record. I love it. I love the other side too, and I really hope it makes it.
With the first set of sessions complete, the band celebrate by watching Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Next day, Brian is busted again for drug possession. At 7 AM, police banged on Brian's door, but he refused to answer. After a long wait, one of the policemen climbs in through the window to find Brian on the phone trying to contact his solicitor. When they search the property, they find some hash in a drawer. As they show it to Brian, he shouts out in despair, "Oh no, this can't happen again just when we're getting our feet. Why do you have to pick on me?" He was inconsolable. On hearing the news, the Stones' hearts sank. The timing couldn't have been worse. They were just about to release their new single Jumping Jack Flash a day later. They worried this would totally overshadow the song. Brian was arrested and taken to Chelsea Station. There he was charged while the press were in attendance and later released on £1,000 bail. He would afterwards leave his flat, grab his possessions and guitars, and head to Keith's country mansion Redlands. For a brief period, Brian would be living with Keith. When the single was released, it exploded. In 3 days, it sold over 93,000 copies. One critic stated it was as perfect as any rock and roll record could be. When the press asked Mick about the single, he played with them, stating the whole thing had been recorded on cassette at his home. He also stated Charlie Watts was the leader of the group and whatever he says goes. Around the same time, the press announced Mick will star alongside James Fox in the upcoming film Performance. Back in the recording studio, they begin on their next song, Street Fighting Man. Mick at this time took an interest in America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Back on the 17th of March, some 50,000, of which included far-left extremists and stoned-out hippies, began a march in London. The intention was to put pressure on the British government to publicly oppose America's involvement in the Vietnam War. The march started in Trafalgar Square before progressing to Mayfair until they reached their destination of the US Embassy building. For those who don't know, this is a place in which American visas are processed, travelling citizens from the US go to when they lose their passport, and events are held to provide information about the US. When the crowd reached the embassy, all hell broke loose. The police began to attack the crowd with brutal force when they attempted to break through the barrier. The protesters began fighting back, throwing stones. This was Mick's inspiration for the lyrics to Street Fighting Man. Jagger's lyrics propelled an anti-authority message while expressing no desire to lead the rebellion. Other than the recording sessions, Keith would spend the rest of 1968 isolated away at Redlands. He began the process of building a recording studio, but at this point all it consisted of was his Philips cassette recorder. It was on the cassette he recorded himself strumming the now iconic riff on his Gibson Hummingbird. He actually bought the Hummingbird in 1965, the year it came out. Next, they begin recording Mick's song Dear Doctor. A comical tune, the song is performed in a party-like atmosphere with Mick singing in a deliberately silly southern drawl. The story follows a man having second thoughts about his upcoming wedding. He complains to his doctor the stress is causing health issues. On the day, he finds a note in his pocket from his fiancée informing him she's now in a relationship with his cousin. Mick later said he sang and wrote it in a country style, employing the tact of looking at life in a comical way. The song ends with the man relieved, reassuring the doctor he's now fine. Musically, it's pure country blues, from Keith's hummingbird to Mick's harmonica. Brian Jones had no participation in this recording. To this day, the song has never been performed live by the band and most likely never will. Next, they begin on the biblical song and the only cover on the album. Prodigal Son was a parable told by Jesus. The character in the story, a young man, asks his father for his inheritance, leaves home and squanders it recklessly. He finds himself in dire straits and returns home hoping for forgiveness. He is after which welcomed back with open arms. The message Jesus was telling in the story was that of forgiveness and that it is possible no matter how far one has strayed. It was the first time a cover had been featured in a Stones album since Out of Our Heads in 1965. The country blues singer Robert Wilkins originally wrote Prodigal Son. He'd started his life as a blues player with a few hits but converted to Christianity, after which he became a minister. 30 years later in 1964, Reverend Wilkins recorded 8 gospel numbers, one of which was Prodigal Son. Wilkins had played the song in open D, same chords, but he used a slide through the verses and picked the strings. No doubt Keith came across the song with his new love of open tunings. Next, they begin recording Factory Girl. The story is very simple. A man waiting for his girlfriend who works in a factory to come home and meet him. It's comical in parts. Keith later stated he introduced it to Mick, as he did in those days many times. He'd begin playing something, and if Mick was interested, they'd work on it. If not, he'd go away and maybe introduce it another time. Musically, there was a deliberate minimal arrangement. Charlie Watts played table drums using sticks instead of his hands. It has a Celtic Zeppelin feel in parts, but the lyrics are pure country. It starts with Keith picking his hummingbird with a plectrum. Standard tuning, believe it or not. Charlie's tambla kicks in before a mandolin features. French-style violin is then heard throughout the song, and Keith hits the strings harder to end the phrase. The song ends quickly, with just a 2 minutes and 10 seconds running time. At this point, the matter of the album art needed to be addressed. On June 7th, the Stones shot the inside cover art for Beggars Banquet inside a Tudor mansion in Hampstead. They were pictured dressed in medieval clothing, engaging in a feast of a whole pig roast. The idea was to portray themselves as rebellion, nonconformist medieval troubadours. The end result is both eccentric and quintessentially English. For the cover, they were chauffeured in limos to Swarkstone Pavilion, where they were pictured in various positions, again in medieval clothing. At this time, Brian appears in court for the hearing of his recent drug bust. He decides to fight the charges, stating the police planted the drugs in his flat. A jury will decide in September whether he's guilty or innocent. At the end of June, Pink Floyd performed the first ever free concert in London's Hyde Park. 15,000 people attend. It was a significant moment, one that would give the Stones an idea to do something similar. Around the same time, they begin recording their next track, Sympathy for the Devil, and in doing so, are documented for a motion picture titled 1+1. Studio One in which they filmed, in fact, used to be a cinema. Jean-Luc Godard's film captured the evolution of the song Sympathy for the Devil and also the dynamics of the group, i.e. Mick and Keith driving a somewhat disinterested Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman. Keith's legendary Gibson Les Paul he'd painted in psychedelic colours during his brief flower power period can be seen in the film. An intoxicated, detached Brian Jones featured, who at this point was somewhat homeless, having been asked to leave his flat in London. Some nights he slept on the pile of cushions in a friend's office and ate a diet of pork pies with HP sauce. At one point during shooting, Brian's filmed without his guitar connected to anything. Mick at the beginning can be seen showing Brian the chords he's written for Sympathy for the Devil. This time, he decided to learn how to play guitar. Eric Clapton, in fact, was teaching him. According to Marianne Faithfull's ex-husband John Dunbar, whom she'd married for all of 12 months, he'd walked into the house one day and caught Mick and Eric in bed together. Filming for 1+1 concluded the same night Godard's light set fire to Olympic Studios' ceiling. Keith later said, the fire broke out so quickly and furiously, it was like being in the Hindenburg. A quick rush was made to gather the master tapes as the flames roared. Jimmy Miller and Bill Wyman ran to the vaults, grabbed the tapes and ran to safety. When the fire brigade arrived, they soaked all the equipment and instruments, watering down the ceiling. The end result of the film was strange, cutting between the Stones recording scenes and the Black Power revolutionaries and young activists. Keith later called it a total load of crap. None of the Stones' party, including the engineers at Olympic, understood what Goddard was attempting. Still, the band were paid over £18,000 for the project. The song Sympathy for the Devil was written by Mick. The narrator is the devil himself. He recounts various evil acts throughout history he was present for, such as the death of Jesus, World War II, the assassination of Kennedy, the Russian Revolution, and the 100-Year War. In the chorus, the narrator doesn't outright say who he is, but he states, "Hope you guess my name." Originally, Mick had titled the song, "The Devil Is My Name." The idea had come to him when he was reading The Master and the Margarita. It had been translated to English a year previously. The book is regarded as one of Russia's greatest literature masterpieces. It tells two stories, one of the devil exposing the greed and corruption in Russia, and the second retelling the trial of Jesus. Mick stated he wrote in a Bob Dylan style, and indeed, when watching 1+1, you can hear him sing in a Bob Dylan-esque voice. In its early stages, it does sound like something that could have been on Bringing It All Back Home. It was Keith who decided the song needed some oomph. The tempo was sped up, percussion was added. Anita Pallenberg sat in the recording booth with producer Jimmy Miller the whole time, and at one point, she heard Mick asking, "Who? Who?" She quickly suggested they use that as a chant in the song. When the chant was recorded, she could be seen joining in with the backing vocal. With recording complete, everyone bar Brian flew to LA to mix the album. While in LA, Anita discovered a graffiti-covered toilet cubicle. She convinced Mick and Keith it would be perfect for the Beggars Banquet album. She then enlisted a photographer to shoot it. Mick plans for the album to be released for his birthday, the 26th of July. In early July, Mick was figuring out how to tackle his film role in performance. He will be starring alongside Anita. Mick spoke to Marianne, an experienced actress herself, as he had no idea how to approach it. Both decided that the character he should play would be Brian, a tragic figure, paranoid and tormented. Mick grew his hair longer, but he didn't dye it blonde. That would have been too much. Instead, he dyed it jet black. The costumes he chose gave him a menacing look, like Richard III. As rehearsals commenced, it was clear just playing Brian was too simplistic. Marianne suggesting adding something else, so Keith was thrown in. Now, there was a combination of fragile and tragic, cool and strong. The result was Turner. Side note, in truth, Mick never quite tapped into Brian's tragedy. There was and is nothing tragic about Mick Jagger, no fatal flaw. Maybe that's what truly separated him musically from John Lennon, Jim Morrison and Brian Wilson. The character set, what Marianne didn't consider, is with Mick tapping into both Brian and Keith, he would become appealing to Anita. After all, Anita had loved them both. Other than helping Mick with his character, Marianne wanted to be as far away from the project as possible. She was expecting Mick's baby and travelled to Ireland with Nicholas and her mother. The child Mick and Marianne both expected to be a girl. They thought of the name Karina in anticipation. Mick was also asked to contribute a song for the soundtrack of performance. He was sent a Moog synthesizer by the manufacturers to aid him. It ended up to be little help. He never mastered the instrument. At the end of the month, Brian again headed to Morocco, this time to record the master musicians of Jigsaw. He stayed at El Manaza Tangier Hotel. Brian phoned Olympic Studios just one day before he left and requested a sound engineer go with him. Staff at Olympic sorted that out straight away at the cost of £100 a day. The engineer collected Brian's 2 UR tape recorders and boarded a flight to Morocco. When there, he and Brian travelled into the mountains where there was no electricity and listened to the master musicians of Jigsaw performing a music ritual to the goat god Pan. As the engineer began recording them, he was careful not to overload the signal and cause distortion. In other words, he was doing the exact opposite of what Keith had done on their next single. After trying several methods, he ended up pointing the microphones of each player at the ground. It was the sonic vibrations bouncing from the earth that were captured on tape. A white goat was then presented to them, taken away, slaughtered, and they later ate him for dinner. Unfortunately, Brian would not live long enough to see the fruits of his labour. The tapes were held in Alan Klein's possession for some time, but he was completely disinterested in the project. He had the tapes shipped to the Stones offices in 1969, and in 1971, as a tribute to Brian, the album Brian Jones Presents the Pipes of Pan at Jujjuka was released. Back in Morocco in 1968, not long after the recording had been completed, Brian passed out unexpectedly. He was even on the balcony of his hotel suite of all places. It was frightening. The engineer found out from Brian's girlfriend it happened all the time. The engineer carried Brian's motionless body to the bed where he slept and later awoke with no recollection of the event. It was a dangerous situation, Brian passing out on a balcony, the engineer remembered. The next day, they went to the beach and Brian warned the engineer about the dangers of swimming in the sea. He insisted the man not go any deeper than his ankles. After that though, it put the engineer off completely. He decided instead to have a nap on the beach. When he awoke sometime later, Brian was gone. He looked into the water and Brian had swam out a good distance. Brian waved to him and against the strong currents, Brian swam straight back to the beach. It was an example of what an excellent swimmer Brian was. The engineer left not long after, partly because he had no other work to do, and partly because he felt guilty about the money Olympic were billing Brian on a daily basis. As he travelled back, the engineer had learned two new facts about Brian. One, he was totally at home in the water, and two, he often passed out unexpectedly. Meanwhile, the filming of Performance had begun on July 29th. It would only be 8 weeks of shooting. They'd be filming in Lord Square, basically what was then run-down townhouses and flats in Notting Hill, London. It was there the character Turner lived. You can see by the footage, the dingy streets of 1968 Notting Hill were a far cry from what they are today. Filming would begin a feud between Mick and Keith, but then maybe the feud would have happened anyway. With Brian now effectively gone, they only had each other to pick at. Performance was basically a portrait of how the public imagined rock stars lived. The characters in the film weren't exactly acting though. They were rock stars, drug addicts. As for the drugs, God only knows what was taken on set. During the filming, Mick began a fling with Keith's girlfriend Anita. Keith feared he would lose Anita to Mick like Brian had lost her to him. Keith never took an interest in the film. He never went to the set. And the reason was simple. He didn't like the director Camell. Keith later said of Camell, his only real love in life was fucking other people over. He had a secret hatred for clever and talented people. Thus, he made it his mission to sabotage them. When Keith was around him, he made fun of Mick's accent, then he made fun of Keith's. Keith did his best to put Anita off even starring in the film. He offered to pay her the same amount of money not to do the film. The problem was, Keith didn't understand it was something Anita wanted to do. In fact, this is understating how devoted Anita was to the project. She later admitted in a 2003 interview at this time she was pregnant with Keith's child and had an abortion so she could give all her focus to the film. Keith believed the affair between Mick and Anita was heavily encouraged by Camell. Camell took delight in the idea he ruined their relationship. Even the fact Mick and Anita were together in the film was a setup carefully orchestrated. Keith later argued Camell only ever had one good movie, that was Performance, and the only reason it was successful was because of the big names attached to it. Camell actually made 4 films. Each one had a similar ending, with the lead character either shot or shooting somebody else. Camell's life, like his films, also ended with a shooting. He committed suicide by self-inflicted gunshot wound. On the set of Performance, he shot the film amongst a vortex of debauchery. According to Marianne Faithfull, Mick was lost in his character, and he began living his character thereon after. Anita Pallenberg, who'd been fascinated by the occult since '67, could barely see reality from fantasy. It is also worth mentioning, Camell had a fiery temper, and could go off like a firecracker, unleashing crazed tirades. But a lot of the time he was calm. He was in his element. Mick and Anita were not. Despite Camell having access to studio space through Warner Brothers, he decided to shoot on location. Some believe it was to capture the authentic atmosphere of London and bring a rawness to the film. Others, because a conventional studio would not ensure privacy and it would be far more tricky to wrestle control from Camell. Obviously, Warner wanted the film shot in a studio. The costs and logistics of shooting on location, not to mention the possibility of delays, were unwanted complications. Camell had originally planned for the cast to move into the dilapidated townhouse. That never came to pass. Mix decorator Christopher Gibbs was brought in to design the interior, to create the look of Turner's house. There was a reason for this. Gibbs had designed the look of Anita and Brian's house. Mick was playing Brian. It was a logical decision. Known for his distressed bohemian style, Gibbs furnished the house with Persian rugs, exotic tapestries, Middle Eastern silks and various artefacts. He gave the flat a warm Moroccan feel, stark contrast to the cold London streets. A four-poster bed with Afghan quilts and pelts was made for the centrepiece. Camell had decided the film would be shot chronologically. As Mick and Anita don't appear until 40 minutes into the film, they won't start shooting until late September. While Keith and Mick were focused on their own issues, Bill Wyman was looking for a more private and peaceful home. I guess a new start with a new girlfriend, actress Astrid Lundstrom. And so he began house hunting. After viewing a few properties, the two came across Gedding Hall. Built in 1480, it features a moat, a gatehouse, and several buildings on 100 acres of land. The house even featured large doors that made easy access to the moat. The couple were blown away on arrival. In fact, they thought they had the wrong house. The grounds were immaculate. Black swans and ducks swam across the moat. The two decided, unless the place was literally falling apart, they would buy it. The owner wasn't there that day. They came back and he showed them round. Bill was taken aback when by the TV stood a full-sized photo of the notorious gangsters, the Cray brothers. The owner informed Bill they were close friends and the gangsters visited Gedding often. Bill put an offer of $41,000 in and it was accepted. The owner did say he'd been offered more by a member of the Queen's family, but he preferred to sell it to Bill, somebody who wasn't born into wealth, a self-made man like himself. Fortunately, at this time the group began receiving their tax bills. But not just that, their record company Decca had refused the album cover of a graffiti-covered toilet cubicle. Mick countered, suggesting they release it in a brown paper bag with the message, "Unfit for children." Decca again refused. They insisted the cover had to have the Rolling Stones name clearly written to encourage maximum sales. They suggested a plain white cover with artsy text. Mick and Keith didn't like the idea, but they also wanted the album out for Christmas, so they gave in. Fortunately, the cover bore a striking resemblance to the Beatles' White Album, which would be released just a month before. With Satanic Majesties similar to Pepper, that was now 2 albums back to back the Stones would release, appearing to be a complete copy of the Beatles, but this time it wasn't their fault. This time there was a dip in single sales, and it was making Decca very hesitant about each move. Street Fighting Man was released as their next single, with No Expectations being the B-side. The single caused controversy and was banned from some radio stations in America. Meanwhile, Brian, on returning from Morocco, hadn't quite sorted out his housing issues. But not for long. Like Bill, he visited a stunning farmhouse in East Sussex, Cotchford Farm, once owned by A.A. Milne, who wrote Winnie the Pooh. Some of the land was even recorded in the Doomsday Book back in 1086. He had an offer accepted for just under $29,000. On the 26th of September, Brian returned to court for his drug trial. He took the stand looking fragile and weak. 50 teenagers stood in the gallery, but were told if they made any noise they would be ejected from the court. When Brian pleaded not guilty, the words were barely audible. Some of the girls were already sobbing. Brian insisted the ball of wool which contained the marijuana wasn't his. He protested, "I haven't owned a ball of wool in my life. I don't darn socks. My girlfriend doesn't darn socks. As the jury were deliberating, Mick and Keith arrived in court. The jury found Brian guilty. When they read out the verdict, he put his head in his hands and rocked back and forth. He was then asked to stand for sentencing. The judge fined him £50 and stated he would receive the same sentence as any young man found guilty of this crime. He then added, "For goodness sake, don't get in trouble again." Outside the court, Mick told reporters they were very happy Brian didn't have to go to jail and money doesn't mean anything. At this point, it was time for Mick to start shooting performance. He and Anita were expected on set at 8 AM each day. Anita smoked marijuana while waiting for her scenes to begin, with her co-star James Fox refusing to use any drugs on set. Amongst a cloud of marijuana smoke, Fox sat studying his script. Anita was staying in a nearby flat paid by Warner. Keith had also moved in. Each night after filming, Anita would be quizzed on the day's events. Keith, according to Anita, slagged off the movie every day. Mick, maybe through guilty conscience, frequently sent bouquets of flowers to Ireland for Marianne. Warner Brothers, out of respect, had kept a distance from set. They were also pleasantly surprised to see the high quality of cinematography in the unedited footage. As the film progressed to the late stages, it was inevitable a rep from Warner would have to make an appearance. By this point, they'd shelled out over $1 million for the production. The man who would appear on set was head of production for Warner Brothers UK. When he arrived, he was so shocked by what he saw on set, he wanted to halt shooting there and then. It actually did stop for a week, but with assurances that everything was under control and the reality that most of the budget had been spent, filming continued. When filming came to an end, Anita requested and was given the 4-poster bed as a souvenir. Keith never knew directly about Anita and Mick, but he sensed it. He always maintained he wasn't a jealous guy, or at least he didn't want anyone to think he was a jealous guy. After all, he did write the lyrics, "A storm is threatening my very life today," about the situation. Keith never did give any reaction to Mick, but he decided to watch closely and see how things played out. After all, if he were to go down and confront Mick, it will probably mean the end of the Rolling Stones. To add another issue, Keith had previously agreed to help Mick with his song for the film's soundtrack. Needless to say, Keith had lost all interest by now. Camell would ask Mick constantly, "What's happening with the song?" and Mick would stall him. When the footage of performance was sent to be processed, the lab boss found some of the scenes in breach of indecency laws. To avoid prosecution, he took some of the processed footage to the parking lot where he destroyed it with a hammer and chisel. When the final product was put together, Warner executives and their wives had a late night screening. Some of the attendees walked out and the film was brought to a halt when an executive's wife threw up. Before the film could even be given a release date, Warner Brothers demanded edits. It took 2 years to negotiate a cut that was acceptable to both Camell and Warner's. Following the filming of Performance, Anita would fall into an abyss. She and Keith began using heroin. They were just snorting it at this point. They were also snorting cocaine, a speedball as it's commonly known. The strange law at the time meant if you registered as a heroin addict, you could be prescribed heroin and cocaine in pill form. Those addicted to the former made good use by selling their supply of cocaine. Needless to say, Keith bought them regularly. In the same time Keith was lost in drug abuse, Marianne lost Mick's baby. Beggars Banquet was a return to the band's blues roots and, ironically, the album that Brian had been least involved in. He had in fact taught Keith the blues tunings when he created the sound for the Stones' second wave. The album was a 180 turn and it was needed. They'd lost credibility with Satanic Majesties. In such a competitive genre of psychedelic rock in 1967, they were irrelevant. In the album, Mick wrote about the working class of England, a tribute in Salt of the Earth, more dismissive in Factory Girl. There were already rumours the band had an interest in Satanism. Sympathy for the Devil had religious groups believing the Stones were devil worshippers corrupting the youth. Other than the controversy it brought, Beggars Banquet returned them to form. It was seen as mature, intelligent work. The second wave had gone, they were entering a new phase, and for Brian, his time not just as a Rolling Stone, but in life, was coming to an end.